you all for joining us today. This is our first workshop series for Centering Equity. My name is Tiana Lyons King, and I am CAM's Community Engagement Manager. Today, we have Yvonne Gallardo with us to speak about cultural equity and what that looks like. Just a quick reminder, this session is one of three. You are not required to attend all three sessions, but if you'd like to, you're welcome to register for the other two if you have not already. Just so you all know, I know you all got the notification upon coming in today that this meeting is being recorded. It will be available for everyone's reviewing pleasure on YouTube in a few weeks. Once that is up, we will go ahead and share that with you all. As we begin this event, we want to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. California is home to over 150 tribes, and an acknowledgement is just one step towards working with Native communities to build meaningful relationships. Museums and many institutions were founded upon purposeful exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples and still benefit from settler colonialism and associated harms. CAM is committed to moving forward and beyond land acknowledgements and into action. We encourage you to learn more about the tribes in your area and find ways to celebrate and support them. Just for everyone else's information here, I am currently living in San Diego, California, which is the traditional territory of the Kumeyaay peoples. We encourage you to check out nativeland.ca. We'll put that link in the chat for you all. It is a helpful but not definitive resource to learn more about the tribes that are in your area. With that, I'm going to move into the housekeeping or expectations for today's workshop series. Just again, this workshop is being recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube. You will all receive a link via email once it is uploaded. Our workshops are a space for learning and collaboration. We ask that you respect yourself and others in the room. The chat box will be open throughout the session. Please feel free to interact with the group and Yvonne via the chat. If there are any questions throughout, we encourage you to use just the chat box. There's no Q&A function today. If I will be here moderating and making sure that those questions don't get lost in the chat, so don't worry about that. And there will be discussion points throughout the session. We ask that you participate at your discretion as they arise, whether that be in the chat box, or if Yvonne is okay with unmuting yourself to speak, feel free to do that. If you don't feel like you want to participate, don't feel pressure to do so. Or if you have a question that you'd like to ask, but you don't want the group to know, you can send the message to me privately and I will be happy to ask the question on your behalf. If you have any technical issues, you can just send me a chat in the chat box, or you can email me at engagement@calmuseums.org. We'll also put that in the chat box for your convenience. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Yvonne. Just a quick reminder, today's session is What is Cultural Equity? And it is one of three sessions. So Yvonne, I am going to go ahead and let you take over here. Everyone, I will be muted and off camera, but I am here if you need anything at all.
Great. Thank you, Tiana. Appreciate it. I'm very happy to be here with you all. It's such a pleasure to share what I have learned and what I know around equity and cultural equity. I do just want to take a moment to ground ourselves in this conversation by sharing my screen here. So first and foremost, I'd love to understand who all is in this room, this virtual room. So I invite you to place your name, your role if you'd like, or the many roles that you exist in and move through, as well as the organization you're representing in the chat. So just go ahead and place your name, role, and organization in the chat. Let's get to know each other. Let's get to know who is in the room. Just skipped. Fingers did some magic there. I want to acknowledge in this moment that we're in one of the many seasons of transition, and to take a moment to hold this moment that we find ourselves in and our world in, the heaviness, the transition, the loss that we're all feeling as it relates to the global events that are now taking place. I want to remind ourselves that when we meet on behalf of yourself or the California Association of Museums or your community or all of the above, I want to remind us that we are conducting ceremony, which in Indigenous practices around the world means a strengthening of connection, providing healing or clarity, marking significant moments, and remembering and practicing gratitude. So breath is obviously an important part of our journeys. So I invite you to be mindful and to breathe as we move through our work together here. And I'd also like to uplift that we accept the collective and personal grief that we all carry and experience in others at this moment, and the many ways that grief intersects our work and relationships. So with that grounding, let's begin. Let's take a look at our time and what we'll be exploring together today. We're going to take a look at our arts and culture ecosystem broadly. Who is our community? Who are our communities? Who are we? How do we fit into this ecosystem called the arts and culture field? We want to take a look at the various definitions of cultural equity. We also want to explore some of the histories of cultural equity in our country, and more specifically, how culturally specific organizations and institutions have advanced and continue to advance cultural equity as just one example of how cultural equity has been advanced long before we have picked up this recent conversation around it. And then most importantly, how does cultural equity show up in the work? We will acknowledge that many of our conversations happen at a very high level, and many of us are still learning how it shows up in our day-to-day work and decision-making. So we'll take a look at that. So first, let's just ground ourselves in this ecosystem. Many of you have likely seen this graphic. SMU Data Arts, that data arts report that we all love to do every year. SMU Data Arts has provided us with a model of our arts and culture ecosystem. Artists are at the nucleus of our ecosystem. Arts and cultural organizations like museums operate in a variety of ways, including producing, presenting, and serving the arts and culture field. Community can be considered as broad as possible and can include arts and entertainment, festivals, concerts, backyard performances, private dance troupes, volunteers, the general public. And then government support is the public investment and support committed to the arts and culture ecosystem. So that includes grants, capital projects, and investments, training, support, and other resources. So as we think about cultural equity, we want to think about how efforts for equity move through each of these components of our ecosystem. Much as I've just shared earlier, much of what the arts and culture field discussions around equity and cultural equity have consisted of have taken place at a very conceptual or theoretical level. We all know the various graphics, whether it is the baseball field, the apple tree, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen these ideas and we've learned about these ideas at a rather high level. So many of us are still learning how it shows up in our day-to-day work. What does cultural equity mean to me and the work that I do and the decisions that I'm making within that work context? So this series aims to explore what we're calling the operationalization of cultural equity. But what I'd like to do is to begin to review the many definitions of cultural equity. So let's take a look at these first. When we talk about change work, whether it's racial equity, diversity, racial equity, cultural equity, equity, inclusion, we understand that change happens at a personal, organizational, or institutional level and at the systemic level. So when we discuss cultural equity, it operates within each of those frameworks. So at the systemic point especially, we're going to take a look at some of the definitions that have been put forth for cultural equity. So one of the things that's clear to those of us who've been studying and working in cultural equity learning spaces is that there is no one definition of cultural equity. Like concepts of equality and equity, cultural equity and our understanding of it continues to grow, expand, and evolve. So let's take a look at what we do know. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 27, states everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefit. Important to note that cultural equity calls for the dismantling of discriminatory systems of all forms, anything that is creating a barrier to fully participating in arts and culture. It addresses the history in the US of the homogeneity of arts and cultural institutions, content, staff, and leadership. So oftentimes when folks hear cultural equity, we're committed to cultural equity, they tend to mistakenly interpret it as light or that's nice. But in fact, when you think about the dismantling of barriers that make way for full participation within our arts and culture ecosystem, it's quite an undertaking and oftentimes intersects other change work lanes like racial equity, equity broadly speaking, accessibility, inclusion. So cultural equity lives in a justice lane as it relates to historic and remaining inequities in our arts and culture ecosystem. Cultural equity is a conversation that is rooted certainly in race, but not exclusively about race. While race is undeniably important to the work of justice in the US, we take into account certainly other aspects of identity, community infrastructure in both subtle and distinct ways. Diversity often starts from a reference point of race, but advocates for intersectionality. And certainly we include under that intersectional umbrella ethnicity, gender identity, socioeconomic status, age, class, and ability status. So Article 5 of the 2001 UNESCO Declaration on Cultural Diversity, the right of access to participation in and enjoyment of culture. Moving to Americans for the Arts, their definition of cultural equity is as follows, quite substantive here. But again, ensuring that all people are represented in the development of arts policy, the support of artists, the nurturing of accessible, thriving venues for expression, and the fair distribution of programmatic, financial, and informational resources. Hearing the words all people might sound a little triggering. But again, when we think about this statement as aspirational, the question then becomes, what are the steps or strategies necessary to get to that North Star? And what equity serves as is that key strategy. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So everyone deserves equal access to full, vibrant, creative lives, which is essential to a healthy and democratic society. Certainly the prominent presence of artists when we think about our ecosystem challenges inequities and encourages us to see alternatives. We cannot put forth or consider an aspirational cultural equity statement or commitment without, again, acknowledging the history of inequities that have existed in the United States. What's great about Americans for the Arts cultural equity statement, or their version of it, is that it acknowledges that in the United States, there are systems of power that grant privilege and access unequally, such that inequity and injustice result, and that must continuously be addressed and changed. Cultural equity is critical to the long-term viability of the arts sector. So when we think and we talk about cultural equity with institutional leadership, whether it's, executive directors or the board, what oftentimes we need to communicate is this is not something that is nice to do. This is actually about our relevance, both now and moving into the future. So it is critical to the sustainability and viability of our sector. We must all hold ourselves accountable, because acknowledging and challenging our inequities and working in partnership is how we make change happen. There are systems of power in the US that grant privilege and access unequally, such that inequity and injustice result, and that must continuously be addressed and changed. So cultural equity is critical to the long-term viability of the arts sector. We can see here, after acknowledging these inequities, both historical and also how these historical inequities have compounded over time and bring us to where we are now when we consider how do we advance cultural equity within our institutions, within our field. And so acknowledgement of historical and persistent inequities, critical to understanding what we must address and how we must address it. The other important resource when it comes to cultural equity is Create Equity. Create Equity was a virtual think tank and publication founded in 2007 to explore issues in arts policy, philanthropy, and research at a systemic level. The initiative sunsetted in 2018, but its work remains available. So you can find their website if you Google, and I'll also provide resources or links to their resources after our time together. So each human being today, as Create Equity puts forth, each human being today and in the future has an opportunity to participate in the arts at a level suited to that person's interest and skill. I'm sorry. I have a tricky finger here. Accordingly, it's important for us to understand the ways in which the current arts ecosystem falls short of this ideal, in particular by failing to include everyone equally or give everyone a fair shot at the opportunities they deserve. Create Equity put forth 4 visions for cultural equity. This was one step further than what we see AFTA putting forth, where these are actual avenues, lanes, or strategies, if you will, through which cultural equity might be advanced. So these are different visions for cultural equity. And what we have seen recently and also historically is that cultural equity has longstanding focus within mainstream institutions around the diversity vision. So we've been talking most and moving and acting in many ways around the vision of diversity. So cultural equity, as we've discussed, is a conversation that is rooted in, but not exclusively about race, because the other 3 visions, prosperity, redistribution, and self-determination, calls for a very intersectional approach that is rooted in value and also some of the mechanics of institutions like budgets, resources, and self-determination. So when we think historically about some of the actions that have moved to advance cultural equity within our field, diversity has tended to primarily focus on audiences, right? The actions of advancing cultural equity begin with audiences, then programs, then leadership, right? That's kind of like when we think about what has been done historically around cultural equity, that's sort of the order of things. Diversity's core concern is about who is ultimately benefiting from the work. If diverse audiences are taking advantage, then that is the surest sign of success, right? One might think. But many early efforts adopted the theme of access to the arts. We heard a lot of access. We still hear a lot of access to the arts on the assumption that underrepresented audiences wanted to participate but could not because of barriers like cost or convenience. One counter argument, let's say, to that assumption is another assumption, which is people who have not traditionally had access to the arts do not have creativity, culture, and artistic expressions in their own communities or in their own spaces, and that, you know, we must give the people we must conduct sort of like ourselves in a charitable way. Again, this altruistic approach to cultural equity. But cultural equity does not call for that. It calls for a more holistic and also mutually beneficial approach to audiences. So we're moving away from that. We're evolving, as we stated earlier. These approaches, these strategies, these considerations are evolving over time. So again, while many proponents see diversity as morally righteous on the strength of these arguments alone, there is a solid business case for relevance too. Again, cultural equity isn't about doing the right thing or the nice thing. It's about, will you be relevant as an institution moving forward into the future? We're seeing many actions and campaigns and efforts that are calling for greater relevance and alignment with where our societies, cultures, and communities are at. They're asking institutions to meet them where they're at. So to that point, many mainstream institutions will have a better chance of making it out in the long run if they can successfully engage more members of their ever-shifting communities through diversification strategies. I'm going to share my screen so you can get into the next part of our discussion. But before we do, I just want to give everyone a heads up that I went ahead and placed the Create Equity resource, their website, in the chat. The Making Sense of Cultural Equity piece on the front page is one that will lead you to those 4 visions. We're going to go a little more deeply into those 4 visions and how they intersect other change lanes like equity, broadly, racial equity, inclusion, accessibility in our next session, but thought it would be helpful to share that resource here. All right. Let me get to the slide and Zoom. Let's do this. So one of the very encouraging things that we know is that this work is not new, right? Advancing cultural equity within a museum context or any institutional organization and within the field broadly is not new. There has been work done. There is work that is continuing to be done, both by your institutions as well as the field at large. So when we talk about cultural equity, it's important to remember that there has been efforts done, that there have been efforts to advance greater equity within our arts and culture field. And so I want to share a little bit about that history, to just again ground us in this work and where we find ourselves in, time-wise. So several generations of artists and activists worked in the latter half of the 20th century to support participation in and expression of cultural heritage, sometimes with the help of private philanthropy, and sometimes, I will say most times, without any help at all. So we see that, that time frame between 1968 and 1971 as a catalytic one, driven by public dollars, by a public commitment to greater diversity, greater cultural equity, through programs like the community-based arts or expansion arts program and the special arts services program. When we think about the longer historical arc, we can go back, I'm sure, even before the 1930s, but one pivotal moment that you can read about on Create Equity's website is the development of the African American theater tradition envisioned by Du Bois, developed in part thanks to New Deal programs. We also know that many muralists during the New Deal from various backgrounds, from a diverse set of backgrounds, were also supported in sharing stories through that discipline, in a public way, engaging arts and culture with the broader public in ways that were never done before in the US. So we do have these attempts supported by some public dollars, beginning in the 1930s, then led at a local level through New York State Council on the Arts, and then certainly at a broader federal level with the NEA's Expansion Arts Program. It is at this time, during the late 60s and early 70s, that we really see the formalization or the more structured foundings or beginnings of community-based arts organizations, culturally specific community-based arts organizations. There were many here in Los Angeles. There are many wonderful resources documenting that movement. And many of that, or the formalization of these various organizations and arts collectives or efforts were funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. And so we see, again, an increase in nonprofit community-based arts organizations that are culturally specific, in an effort to advance cultural expression, a greater participation in arts and culture by community, not just because they wanted to do that, but because many groups, not just culturally specific or ethnocultural groups, many groups were excluded from predominantly white institutions at this time. We're emerging from a larger socio-political time of change with the civil rights movement, the Fair Housing Act, the Federal Bilingual Education Act. All of these are intersecting and influencing the development and change around how we see ourselves through arts and culture, how we see the diversity of our country through the expression, production, and presentation of arts and culture. And then more recently, we find a cultural policy adopted within LA County, Los Angeles County, that roots itself in cultural equity. So there have been cultural policies passed before, but one that roots itself in the commitment to cultural equity is either not as explicit as this more recent policy has demonstrated, or it's just broader based or focused on solely diversity. So the LA County Board of Supervisors adopts a cultural policy rooted in cultural equity. This didn't happen overnight. I was part of the effort around LA County's Cultural Equity and Inclusion Initiative that literally went out. We had 14 town halls. I went to places in Los Angeles County that I'd never been before. I was really excited to see how folks talk about and consider cultural equity and how they want to engage with arts and culture and where they want to engage in arts and culture. So it was rooted in a very a commitment to the diverse voices of residents, right? There's those of us in the field, and we've been talking for a long time about this, whether it was multiculturalism in the 80s and 90s or cultural equity and inclusion more recently. We have had those conversations. It was important for us to understand, how do we serve residents? So that cultural policy rooted in cultural equity was informed by those conversations, by perspectives of the diverse communities within LA County. So really, really a very holistic approach to how we form not only policy, but how we consider cultural equity. So the fruits of these efforts today include a number of prominent institutions presenting works of artists of color, right? So as a result of this massive development of organizations, of nonprofit organizations, collectives, institutions in the late 60s and early 70s, we have before us a wonderful array of culturally specific institutions and organizations. At the national level, we have the Association of African American Museums, and at a service level, I'm very proud to be involved with the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture, or cultures, I should say, and thousands of ethnocultural organizations providing important services within their communities. So when we think about cultural equity, what are best practices? How might we approach it? We have, through various publications, authors, workers in the field, put forth that sort of recommendation or suggestion that we look to these organizations and how we might approach cultural equity. How have they been engaging diversity within their own communities? How have they been engaging communities? And how are they advancing a more inclusive approach to presenting, producing, creative works in a way that brings everyone along. So oftentimes culturally specific organizations or other institutions and organizations who have a clear focus from a perspective that has been oftentimes marginalized, oppressed, or excluded, those are the folks we should be looking to in terms of how might we approach this work within our own institution. How might we learn from this work, from these organizations, in a way that advances our own work effectively? And again, it calls into question, or it calls us to consider, what do healthy partnerships look like in that effort? What do we just, call up or reach out to our, African American fellow museums when it's Black History Month? Or do we only reach out to our Latino institutions around Day of the Dead? So what is that relationship? What does it look like? What does a sustainable relationship look like? And what does a mutually beneficial relationship look like? What we know is that there's been a long history of institutional efforts to bring equity to the arts, and even a longer history of artists and communities advancing cultural equity because they were excluded from predominantly white institutions. Despite the work and innovative business models that culturally specific organizations have developed and executed over time, including critical and nuanced engagement practices, rarely known and valued in our sector, that have now become critical to our mainstream arts and culture ecosystem in the US, funding from both private and public sources remain entrenched in inequities that favor larger mainstream arts organizations. So there's the work that museums and institutions do. There's the work that has been done within communities, organizations and institutions that have been developed in a focused way for communities that have historically been marginalized or oppressed. And then there's the value that our arts and culture funders have placed in their distribution of resources in different ways, right? We're still seeing that when it comes to philanthropy, both private and public, that culturally specific organizations, museums, institutions are substantially underfunded still to this day. So we still have work to do. The legacy of those efforts, those broader efforts that we shared historically here, includes several prominent arts and cultural organizations presenting works by African, Latinx, Asian, Arab, and Native American artists and artist collectives. Examples include Leimert Park Village. Here, I'm just going to speak to some of my local favorites. Leimert Park Village, Japanese American Cultural and Community Center, Self-Help Graphics, Watts Towers Arts Center, Arab Cultural and Community Center, Plaza de la Raza, Mamie A. Clayton Library and Museum, the Japanese American National Museum, William Grant Still Arts Center, just to name a few among thousands of ethnocultural organizations providing important services within their community and across the country, and from whom we have much to learn. So the point of this is advancing cultural equity has been around for a long time. There's a history of advancing cultural equity even within your museum and institutions. And it's important to think about that arc of history to understand what has been attempted, what has not worked, what has worked, and what might need to be updated in order to have greater impact or relevance when it comes to those goals that we've developed around cultural equity. This is the first of a series. We're talking sort of higher level. The next series, or the next workshop in this series, will break down how cultural equity intersects and works with other change lanes like racial equity, accessibility, disability or ability justice, as well as equity and inclusion considerations more broadly. So we're going to get into how this work is intersecting other efforts to advance equity within our field and within a museum context. So we'll take a deeper look at things like board. We'll take a deeper look at things like audience engagement and even philanthropy, donors, development, and how cultural equity is advanced within those contexts. So just again, want to thank you all for your time and commitment to cultural equity. Would love to have you back and hear more stories. But the next session will also review very high level review of what we did here today, and then go into some of the more specific topics of that session. So thank you all. I'm going to hand it back to Tiana and see you all next week.
Yvonne, you've pretty much wrapped up everything that I was going to say. If you guys are not signed up already for the next section or the session after that, I went ahead and put the link in the chat for you all. And with that, we will see you all next week. And thank you so much for joining us today. Hope you all have a great day.